Hello, I'm Nathan Blaisdell with Third Church of Christ Scientist, Dallas, Texas, and I'm here today with Mark McCurties, who is a Christian Science practitioner and lecturer, who will be giving a lecture entitled Meaningful Change for Ourselves and the World on Thursday, October 29th at 7 p.m. Central Time via Zoom. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
It's a pleasure. So happy that you've taken some time to include me in preparing for the lecture.
First of all, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to become a Christian Science practitioner and lecturer?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably helpful to know that I was raised in a Christian Science family. So my mother and father were Christian Scientists. I had grandparents who were Christian Scientists, and my brothers and sisters. We all went to Christian Science Sunday School, where we learned a lot more about the Bible, particularly loved as a young man growing up Bible stories and the individual triumphs they had over evil and suffering and disease and whatever the hardship seemed to be. Their love of God, their dependence on God always brought them wonderful victories, and that was really meaningful to me as a little boy. So going to a Christian Science Sunday school, I learned a lot more about the Bible, and I also learned how that same power and presence of God's love is still very much available and accessible to us today through the teachings of Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy, who discovered and founded the Christian Science Church, she saw something of the present availability of God's love. She saw that remarkable healing work that we read about in the Bible, the wonderful healing work of Jesus' ministry, the unparalleled healing work in Jesus' ministry, that it was supported by God's spiritual and eternal laws, and the same laws of God that were bringing help and healing to folks 2,000 years ago are actually still around today. They're the same laws of God that operate with the same power and authority to support and protect and defend our lives today and to bring needed help and healing. So I learned more about that going to a Christian Science Sunday school. And as I got older and went to college and got into the workforce, I had an opportunity to start really putting what I had learned into practice and seeing how God's laws and how God's love could bring help and healing to me and to the world around me. And I became so inspired by the healing that I was seeing and by the presence of God's love that I was growing into a larger understanding of, that it just felt right to devote my full time and attention to helping other people know that they too could see something of God's healing love and that they too could learn more about these spiritual laws that reveal the harmonious nature of God's creation. And so when that became such a strong desire for me, I became a Christian Science practitioner. And a few years later, I got involved with lecturing and sharing the teachings of Christian Science and the message of God's healing love with the wider world. So it's been a lovely journey, and it continues.
You've already touched a little bit on this, but could you briefly explain what Christian Science is?
Christian Science is a denomination, a Christian church that was founded by Mary Baker Eddy. And the church is founded on the basis of wanting to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ in the highest degree possible. And that includes doing the same wonderful healing work that Jesus was doing during his ministry. Jesus himself said that if we believed on him, if we believed on Christ and accepted the healing power and presence of God's love into our hearts, that we could see that healing power, that divine power, having a practical effect in our lives. And so Mary Baker Eddy discovered that behind that healing work was a set of spiritual laws, divine laws, that actually support and reveal God's power in our experience and in practical ways. And so she worked and endeavored to prove those laws in her own experience through wonderful healing that she did. People came to her who were in need of help, cases that were often considered incurable or hopeless, and she healed those individuals just through prayer, through a recognition and acknowledgement of these spiritual laws. And so she began to really show that the power of God's love that was so evident, so alive and available during Jesus' ministry was just as alive and relevant and present in our lives today, and established a church that was committed to following the teachings of Christ Jesus, and to doing and to continuing this healing work in conjunction with God's laws. I think sometimes it's helpful for people to know that Christianity and science can pair together, because Christianity includes a commitment to wanting to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. It recognizes that salvation comes through Christ, and science recognizes that God has laws that help to support that salvation, that God has spiritual laws that we can know, that we can learn, that we can understand, and that we can actually apply to see this healing power of the Christ in our lives in needed and relevant ways. And so that's a little bit more about what Christian Science is. That's what the church is all about. Mary Baker Eddy said of her initial church that it was designed to reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. And that included in that salvation of Christ is the ability to see God's power bringing practical healing results in our everyday experience.
Could you talk a little bit about how to prayerfully address some of the issues facing our country and the world today?
That's a great question. It really is something that we're going to address in the lecture, which is why it would be so great to have you tune in to the lecture. There's an awful lot for us to be thinking about, for us to be digesting at the moment. And the conversation in the lecture itself is meant to be a discussion about how can God help us right now to sort through, to process all that we're seeing and dealing with in our own individual lives and what we're seeing in our communities, in our country, and around the world. I think that's the number one question that I hope to both ask and answer in a degree, in as much as it can be answered in an hour, is how is God's power and presence able to bring practical help into our experience right now? I think that one of the things that we might consider is just simply understanding that God is present, that in the midst of all the hard things that we're dealing with all the strife and the disagreement and the bitterness and the search for health and safety, that God is present. That's one of the things that I have been praying with on a regular basis, just acknowledging that God is present and that we have a right to feel God's presence in our lives, and that there's no situation or circumstance that can ever cut us off from the love of God. And as we understand more about God's presence, we can learn more about God's power. You see, it's the recognition of God's presence that prepares us to accept God's power. And conversely, the more we understand about God's power, the more we can feel God's presence. So I think for me, again, in the face of a lot of ugly and terrible things that we're sorting through right at this moment, it has been a real source of comfort and strength to continually affirm that God is present, and that I have a right to see and to feel and to know that presence in a tangible way that speaks to me right where I'm at, and that understanding of God's presence helps me to also see and know God's power. So that's one of the simple ideas that I've been working with over the last several months here.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today, Mark. For more information on attending the lecture, go to healingdfw.com/events.